It was just after noon when my phone lit up on the kitchen counter. I was rinsing the last bit of grit from my French press, the kind of mundane ritual I never rushed. The spring breeze slipped through the cracked window, cool and unbothered. Then the vibration came, a soft buzz against the marble. I glanced, read, blinked. $3,000 withdrawal from joint checking. Chase. I didn't drop the glass, didn't flinch. I just stood there, water running over my fingers, reading the words again like they were part of some psychological experiment. The message was brief, blunt, and utterly familiar. I dried my hands, folded the towel neatly, picked up the phone and locked the screen, then turned back to the sink and finished what I'd started. There was no rush of panic, no rage bubbling up. My mother used to say I had a quiet fire, that I burned slow, but when I did, it stayed lit. I believe in order, in control, in precision. My hair is always pinned back, my receipts always filed. I don't leave dishes in the sink. I don't let emotions run unchecked, and I don't let $3,000 vanish without a trace. I didn't need to wonder who did it. There was only one person with access to that account. One man who charmed his way past every hesitation I'd ever had about mixing love and money. Marcus Shaw, my ex. We had broken up 3 weeks ago. No fights, no scenes. Just two tired people agreeing it was time to stop pretending. We even made it civilized, like grown-ups. We'll leave the joint account untouched, he'd said, looking me in the eye, just until the last bills are handled. I'd nodded, not because I believed him, but because I wanted to. The coffee pot clinked against the sink as I set it down. I glanced out the window where a crow hopped along the fire escape with something shiny in its beak. A scrap of foil, maybe. It looked pleased with itself. Clever. Opportunistic. I watched it disappear into the sky, and my lips curved. Barely. Because I had alerts turned on, because the trap had been triggered, and Marcus had just walked straight into it. The night we ended things, it didn't feel like an ending. No slammed doors, no accusations. Just two people on opposite ends of a couch, wine glasses untouched, a jazz playlist murmuring low in the background. Marcus tapped his fingers on his thigh, his tell. He always did that when he was trying to seem calm. I watched the rhythm, steady and aimless, and folded my hands in my lap. We'll split everything clean, I said. I'll take care of the final rent. You handle the power bill. We close the joint account after that. He nodded, like he was agreeing to lunch, not dismantling a shared life. That was Marcus, smooth on the surface, always avoiding the jagged edges. He smiled faintly, like it didn't hurt. No drama, he said, lifting his glass for a sip he never took. We're not those people. We weren't. But not because we were better, because I didn't give him the performance he wanted. Marcus hated confrontation, hated being the villain. He preferred the soft exit, the quiet fading, the kind of ending where you could still call each other on birthdays and pretend there'd never been a breach. But this wasn't some storybook dissolve. It was a slow collapse, one I'd seen coming long before we said the words out loud. We made a list that night. Groceries, streaming subscriptions, shared furniture. He pretended to care about who got the blender, but his eyes lingered a little too long on the final line of the page. Joint checking. Close after May 1st. I'll leave it alone, he promised, voice just warm enough to sound sincere. You'll see. I didn't answer right away. Just nodded once and picked up my glass. We didn't touch. Didn't cry. We stood when the conversation ended, not as ex-lovers or old friends, just two people who once believed in a future that didn't survive the logistics. The next morning he moved out. left behind a pair of socks, a half-used bottle of cologne, and a bag of almonds in the pantry. I stood in the doorway after he left, arms crossed, breathing in silence like it was something new. I thought that was the hard part. The separation, the adjustment, the awkward texts about who still had the HDMI cord or whether we'd forgotten to cancel Hulu. But I was wrong. Because men like Marcus don't always leave with the same grace they perform on the way out. They wait, they watch, and they bet on you letting your guard down. He wanted things clean, on the surface. But deep down, he still wanted control. And I could feel it in the way he walked out like he hadn't just spent months dodging real conversations, in the way he called our agreement fair, like fairness had ever been part of his math. 3 weeks later, 3,000 vanished. And the man who promised no games had just made his first move. By Saturday morning, the folder was no longer just a container. It was a statement. I cleared my table the way I used to prep for client meetings, wiped it down, opened the blinds just enough to let in light, stacked my supplies on the side, printer paper, highlighters, tabs. This wasn't a reaction. It was a response. Precise, purposeful. I logged into the bank again and filtered by date. Every transaction laid bare, timestamps, access method, recipient. Marcus's name appeared with disturbing frequency, each line another betrayal wrapped in routine. I exported them one by one, printed clean copies. No scribbles, just data. Then I labeled each withdrawal with notes in the margin, the exact time, what we were supposedly paying for, and what had actually been discussed. The numbers didn't lie. They lined up like breadcrumbs. $3,000 on a Thursday night. $5,000 during his usual gym hour, no bills due, no communication, just silence on his end and the sound of money slipping quietly from my future. He assumed I wouldn't dig this deep, that I'd accept the hit and tell myself to move on. But he hadn't watched me run events for 100 clients at once. He hadn't seen the spreadsheets I used to build seating charts, logistics schedules, contingency plans. I didn't improvise. I executed. I dug into our texts, scrolled back to the week we broke up, to the lines where he confirmed, clear as daylight, that the joint account would stay untouched until everything was squared, screenshotted, printed, filed. I highlighted his words in yellow. Not to gloat, to remember. Every document had a home. The folder grew, sheet by sheet. I used tabs for the transfers, a separate section for communication, and a final tab for the agreement. It wasn't a contract, but it was enough. At the end, I wrote a brief summary. 1 paragraph. Factual, dated, signed. I didn't tell anyone. No dramatic recounts to friends. No late-night texts for validation. This wasn't about sympathy. It was about truth. About documenting what people like Marcus count on being forgotten or misremembered. That afternoon, I stood over the folder and closed it with both hands. It felt heavier than its size allowed. This wasn't about $8,000. Not really. It was about the assumption that I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't act, that my silence was a gap he could walk through without consequence. He'd miscalculated. Because the truth wasn't mine to scream. It was mine to prove. And I had just finished gathering the evidence. That evening, I spread the printouts across the dining table like a crime scene reconstruction. Each transaction was its own breadcrumb. Each timestamp a step in a route Marcus thought he could walk without leaving footprints. But he was wrong. The first $3,000 had come through late on a Thursday night. The second $5,000 just after noon on a Monday. Both aligned with moments I could place. His gym schedule, his usual downtime between clients. I knew his rhythm better than he realized. He wasn't desperate. He was opportunistic. And he assumed I wouldn't track the pattern. But there it was, blooming on the table in black and white. The gaps between withdrawals were shrinking, the amounts increasing. He wasn't waiting to get caught. He was betting I wouldn't look. I color-coded the entries. Green for known bills, red for personal withdrawals, yellow for messages we exchanged on the same days. It was all there. His voice saying one thing, his actions spelling out another. There was no confusion, no technical glitch, just theft carried out in quiet increments. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the money itself, but the method. The entitlement. The way he moved through this like he had time on his side. Like he believed I'd either be too kind or too embarrassed to do anything about it. Marcus always prided himself on being smooth. Always had the right thing to say, the easy laugh, the disarming shoulder squeeze. But smooth doesn't hold up under scrutiny. It slides. It slips. And now, it was unraveling. I added our last rent payment to the file. The one he promised to split, then quietly never followed through on. I still had the receipt. Of course I did. I filed it behind the withdrawal logs. Another small lie folded into the record. Then came the texts. I scrolled through our message history again, slower this time. Captured screenshots of every promise, every assurance, every casually delivered line that now sat in direct contradiction to what he'd done. I grouped them by theme, labeled them with dates. It was like watching a mask fall in reverse, seeing all the clues I'd missed, now glowing in hindsight. None of this was impulsive. It was calculated, and that realization stripped away whatever softness had remained. This wasn't just about cleaning up a mess. It was about refusing to pretend there hadn't been one in the first place. By midnight, the timeline was complete. The folder organized, my resolve absolute. He thought silence meant surrender. That because I didn't raise my voice, I wasn't keeping track. But the truth is, I don't forget. I document. And now, the story he thought he was writing alone had a second author, and I was almost ready to publish. I made the call on a Tuesday morning. The bank's customer service line was quiet at first. Gentle music, a polite voice asking for my name, my account number. I answered every question in the same tone I'd used to place an order. Calm, unshaken, routine. But this wasn't routine. This was the shift. I'm calling to report unauthorized activity on a joint checking account, I said. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that comes when someone's been trained not to react. Then the representative asked for details. I gave her everything, dates, amounts, recipient names. She didn't interrupt, just typed. When she asked for context, I gave her the facts, stripped of emotion. My ex and I agreed the account would remain untouched until all joint expenses were closed. He accessed the funds without notice. There's a pattern. I have documentation. Her tone changed subtly, professional still, but firmer. She asked if I had copies of the transfers. I did. Screenshots? Printouts? A timeline? She asked if I'd submitted a written complaint. I had, the night before, through their online portal. Would you classify this as intentional misuse? Yes, I said. Absolutely. She gave me a case number, transferred me to their fraud department. A second voice came on, sharper, brisk, practiced. We started again, but this time it felt official, real. She reviewed my file and said the internal risk team would be assigned. The account would be flagged. Outgoing transfers frozen. Marcus wouldn't be able to touch another dollar. I thanked her and ended the call. The room was quiet again. Sunlight hit the stack of papers on my table just right, throwing long shadows across the floor. The folder sat open beside me, its edges crisp, pages aligned. I added the case number to the cover sheet, printed a confirmation email, filed it behind the timeline. Each step had been deliberate, each move calculated. He still didn't know. I hadn't told him, hadn't warned him. Let the silence stretch long enough to become weight. He probably thought he'd gotten away with it, that the withdrawals were unnoticed, unchallenged, that the joint account was still a shared space, open to casual betrayal. But it wasn't. Not anymore, because I'd taken his lies and turned them into a ledger, translated his silence into statements, his theft into structure. This wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity. And the first real piece of justice didn't come with a confrontation. It came with a case number and a system quietly shifting into place. He didn't know it yet, but the game was over. And I was already writing the final score. The alert came on a Wednesday morning, just as I stepped out of the shower. Steam still lingered on the mirror, soft curls of condensation fading as I wiped a clear circle with my palm. My phone lit up on the vanity, its screen glowing with precision. Failed transaction alert, 2,000 transfer attempt declined. I stared at the words, letting them settle. The steam, the silence, the alert, they all hung together in the air. He tried again. Even after the freeze, even after pulling $8,000 in total, even after vanishing without a single explanation. He thought the account was still his to touch, still open, still vulnerable, but not anymore. The freeze worked. My call mattered. The structure I'd built, paper by paper, day by day, had held. I didn't smile, not fully, but there was a stillness in my chest, a kind of confirmation that lives just under the skin. Not joy, not triumph, just proof. I got dressed slowly, chose my favorite sweater, pulled on jeans that fit just right, boots with a quiet heel, nothing flashy. I wasn't going anywhere special, but it felt important. The way you carry yourself matters, even in your own kitchen. I brewed coffee and sat down at the table, pulled the folder close, printed the new alert, 3-hole punched it, slid it into the back, another entry in the timeline, another decision Marcus had made under the belief I'd never follow through. I imagined him in that moment, sitting at his desk or scrolling on his phone in a cafe, thinking this would be easy. Entering the amount, confirming the transfer, and then watching it bounce. Maybe he refreshed the screen, maybe he tried again, maybe he cursed, confused, maybe that was the moment he realized something had changed, that I wasn't waiting anymore, that the silence wasn't softness, it was strategy. I didn't text him, didn't acknowledge it. Let the alert speak louder than words. Later that day, the bank followed up with a status update. They were escalating the investigation. A full internal review had been triggered. Marcus would be contacted. His version of events would be documented, and his name would be flagged across the system. The file was working. The truth, all of it, had structure now. A spine. A narrative. One that didn't depend on raised voices or emotional appeals. He thought I'd left the door unlocked, but I had sealed it, quietly, thoroughly. And now, he was standing on the other side, rattling a handle that no longer turned. By the end of that week, I knew what I needed to do. It wasn't about anger. I didn't want an apology. I didn't need Marcus to admit anything. This wasn't about conversation. It was about confirmation. He'd taken what wasn't his and assumed I'd stay quiet. He thought the worst I'd do was stew in private. Maybe send a passive-aggressive message, maybe block his number and move on. But I didn't want revenge. I wanted reckoning. Calm. Clean. On record. So I sent the message. Hey, I have something I want to talk to you about. Neutral ground? It took him less than an hour to respond. Sure, let's catch up. Been meaning to talk anyway. Then a thumbs up. Then a cafe suggestion. Of course, he picked the place we used to go. Corner table, soft lighting, exposed brick. Familiar enough to feel safe. Nostalgic even. He probably thought I missed him. That I wanted to clear the air. That I was struggling with the silence. Let him think that. The morning of the meeting, I got ready like I used to for a client presentation. Nothing too sharp, nothing too soft. Intentional, quiet, power. Neutral trench. Clean lines. Gold hoops. Just enough structure to say I'd planned for this, but not so much it screamed confrontation. I checked the folder twice before sliding it into my tote. Everything was there. Transaction logs, the printed timeline, screenshots of our agreement, text with dates. I'd even written a cover sheet. Not dramatic, not emotional, just facts in a linear format. It wasn't a threat. It was documentation. When I arrived, the cafe was half full. The window table was open. I took it, ordered water. No coffee, no pastry. The folder stayed zipped inside my bag. He arrived 10 minutes later, sunglasses perched on his head, that same easy smile he wore when he didn't know what was coming. "Hey," he said, leaning in for a hug like we were old friends. "You look good." I nodded. "You too." He sat, settled in, started talking about work, about some vague consulting gig, about possibly traveling soon. He didn't ask why I wanted to meet. That told me everything. Marcus thought this was a casual reunion. He thought I wanted to feel close to something that had already ended. But I didn't come for closure. I came to put facts on the table. And while he talked, carefree, rehearsed, at ease, I waited, my hand resting lightly on the bag in my lap, my posture still, my eyes steady. Because he had no idea the story he was telling was already over, and I had brought the ending with me. He kept talking. Marcus leaned back in his chair like this was any other afternoon. His fingers tapped the side of his glass as he spun stories about new projects, old contacts, vague future plans. He spoke like he was performing for someone who still wanted to believe in him, but I didn't. Not anymore. I nodded occasionally, just enough to keep the rhythm going. Let him mistake politeness for softness, composure for warmth. He didn't notice the weight in my silence. Didn't feel the shift in temperature. He was too busy narrating a version of himself that had already expired. "I'm glad we're doing this," he said, smiling over the rim of his drink. "Things don't have to be awkward between us, you know?" I tilted my head slightly. No smile, no response. He took that as agreement. Of course he did. For Marcus, comfort was currency. If you weren't shouting, if you weren't crying, then things must be fine. He measured damage by decibels. He didn't understand that silence could be sharper than any scream. The drinks arrived. He thanked the waitress with that practiced charm he always leaned on when he needed to reset a mood. I waited until she walked away. Then, slowly, I unzipped my bag and pulled out the folder, placed it gently on the table. My fingers rested on the cover, still and steady. Marcus paused. His smile faltered, just a fraction, not enough for most people to notice, but I did. "What's that?" he asked, voice trying to stay casual. I slid it forward. Documentation. He hesitated, then opened it. The first page stared back at him. Bank statement. His name circled in red. He flipped it. Timeline. Transaction breakdown. Screenshots of texts with timestamps. He didn't speak. I didn't either. I just watched. Watched the shift in his posture, the way his fingers slowed at the page corners, the flicker of his jaw tightening as he tried to process what this was, what it meant. He looked up at me, eyes searching for some clue, a softness, a smile, a way out. But I gave him nothing, because I hadn't come for a reaction. I'd come for the shift, and I was watching it happen, right there across a cafe table where he thought charm would carry him one more mile. The folder said everything I didn't, every dollar, every lie, every assumption he made about who I was and how far I'd go. Now, the air between us was heavier than the weight of the paper, and for the first time, Marcus Shaw looked like a man who had lost control of the narrative. The first message came that evening, just 5 words. Can we talk for a sec? No punctuation, no context, no apology. I didn't respond. I read it once, let the little read indicator appear beneath his name, then set my phone down and finished making dinner. Roasted vegetables, quinoa, a glass of wine, the kind of meal I used to share, now served on one plate. He followed up an hour later. I think we should clear the air. This doesn't have to be messy. I didn't respond to that one either. Because it wasn't messy. Not on my end. It was structured, filed, under investigation. It was only messy if you hadn't seen it coming. The next morning, another ping. You really froze the account? That one made me pause. Not because of what he asked, but how. The tone, the disbelief, as if he still couldn't accept I'd gone through with it, as if the idea of me acting without his knowledge, without warning, was somehow beyond what he believed I was capable of. That was always the blind spot. He thought silence meant softness. But my silence was doing more work than his words ever could. I didn't block him. I didn't need to. Let him send what he needed to send. Let him scramble. His text became a steady drip, each one wearing a different mask. One was nostalgic. Remember our weekend in Asheville? I keep thinking about that cabin. Another was defensive. You could have just asked for the money back. It didn't have to go this far. And then, you're really going to let a bank come between us? As if this were about the bank. As if the bank had been the one to take what wasn't theirs. But I let them pile up, read them, archived them, screenshotted the most telling ones, added them to the folder. Not because I needed more proof, but because every message confirmed what I already knew. Marcus didn't understand consequences unless they came with noise. But this wasn't noise. This was precision. And silence was the sharpest part of all. He called once. I let it ring. The voicemail was a soft mix of anger and pleading. You know I wouldn't really screw you over, he said. You know me. But that was the problem. I did know him. Better than he ever knew me, and this time knowing was enough. I went for a walk after dinner. The evening air was crisp, the breeze light. I passed a couple walking their dog, 2 kids riding bikes, a woman reading on her porch. The world moved on, and so did I. Without replying, without flinching, without looking back. The official email arrived the following Tuesday. Subject line, fraud case status update. I opened it with steady hands. No rush, no anticipation, just confirmation of what I already knew was coming. An investigator had been assigned to my case. Her name was Marissa Lang. The email provided a direct line, a secure portal for document uploads, and a list of follow-up questions. It was clinical, efficient, direct. Exactly what I wanted. I replied within the hour, uploaded everything. Transaction logs, communication history, screenshots of our agreement. I included a signed declaration summarizing the terms Marcus and I had agreed on before the withdrawals began. Every page was labeled, every file named with date and content. No clutter, no emotion, just structure. Marissa called that afternoon. Her voice was calm, experienced. The kind of tone that doesn't flinch, doesn't bend. She thanked me for my detailed submission, then asked a few clarifying questions. When was the last transaction you both agreed on? April 3rd? Have you had any written communication from him acknowledging the withdrawals? No, only denials and vague messages after the account was frozen. Have you confronted him directly? Yes, once. At a public location, he confirmed he took the money but downplayed the impact. She paused for a moment, then said, "You've been very thorough." I didn't respond to the compliment. I just answered her next question. The call lasted 15 minutes. When it ended, I added the summary to the folder, printed a transcript of our conversation notes, slipped it into the file, another layer, another record. I thought briefly about what Marcus might say when they called him, whether he'd pretend confusion or feign innocence, whether he'd twist our agreement into something loose and unprovable, but I didn't linger, because he didn't have the file. He didn't have the screenshots. He didn't have the sequence. He had assumptions. I had evidence. After the call, I went to the window. The late afternoon light had a softer angle now, stretching long shadows across the floor. The apartment was quiet, but not empty. There was something alive in the silence now, something solid. This wasn't about payback, it was about proof. That you can act without shouting. That boundaries don't have to be drawn in anger to hold firm. That protection doesn't have to look like armor to be unbreakable. Marcus thought I was behind him, that he'd left me quiet and sorting bills. But I was ahead of him the whole time. And now, the system was watching too. The days that followed moved with an unfamiliar kind of ease. Not because things were resolved, there were still calls to wait for, reports under review, but because the fog had lifted. The second guessing, the over-explaining, the bending, gone. I began replaying moments I had once dismissed, the small things that now echoed louder in hindsight. The time he borrowed my credit card for gas, then forgot to mention the online purchase that followed. The month he swore he paid his half of rent, but couldn't find the confirmation. The way he flattered his way out of questions. How easily he turned tension into affection. Back then, I softened. I told myself not to overreact, that it wasn't worth the fight, that he meant well. But meaning well doesn't mean doing right. And patterns don't lie. What Marcus took from me wasn't just money. It was the certainty I used to carry. The confidence that fairness would hold if I just stayed calm, stayed generous, stayed available. He didn't break me. He just slowly eroded the ground beneath me. Inch by inch, charm by charm. Now, I saw it all with clarity. The withdrawals weren't a deviation from his character. They were the natural conclusion of a pattern I'd ignored too long. I spent an evening sorting through old photos, not out of nostalgia, but to close the loop. Vacation snapshots, dinner dates, Sunday mornings with coffee and books, and half-shared playlists. We looked happy, And maybe we were, in parts. But even in those images, I could see the unevenness now. My smiles carried weight, effort, investment. His looked like escape. He always knew I was capable. He just never thought I'd direct that capability at him. But I had. And not with rage. With facts. With timestamps. With patience. I placed the photos back into the envelope, sealed it, and slid it to the back of my desk drawer. Not erased, just filed away. That was what healing looked like for me. Not burning the past, cataloging it. Because I wasn't erasing the story. I was reclaiming authorship. That night, I lit a candle in the living room. Let the scent of sandalwood thread through the quiet. I left my phone on the counter, turned face down. I didn't need to check if Marcus had texted. I didn't need to know what version of the story he was telling himself. Because mine was complete. And it didn't need approval, it only needed truth. And I had already delivered that. It was a Thursday afternoon when the final message came. Another email from the bank. The subject line simple, almost sterile. Fraud case status update, final review. Complete. I clicked it open without hesitation. No fear. No hope. Just stillness. Inside was a short paragraph. No legalese, no padding. The investigation was complete. My claim had been substantiated. The withdrawals were deemed unauthorized under the joint account agreement. Marcus's access had been permanently revoked. I was entitled to restitution. If I chose to press charges, the report was available upon request. There it was. Not vengeance, validation. I didn't forward the email to Marcus. Didn't send a screen capture. Didn't reply to any of his old messages that still sat unread in my inbox. He didn't deserve the weight of my silence broken by a final line. The system had spoken, and that was enough. I printed the email and placed it in the final sleeve of the folder. It slid into place like the last puzzle piece, snug and undeniable. The folder was full now, a complete record of what happens when someone mistakes composure for weakness. Later that evening, I stood by the window, tea in hand, watching the street lamps blink on. The pavement was still damp from the afternoon rain. The city moved beneath me like it always did, indifferent, unbothered. The world didn't change when you got justice. It just gave you space to breathe again. I breathed. Not with relief, but with clarity. The account was frozen. The truth was filed. The lies were logged and time-stamped and archived in black and white. What Marcus did would never be undone. But it didn't need to be. Because I wasn't chasing restitution anymore. I was standing in it. Not because someone handed it to me, but because I built it, quietly, methodically, completely. The last time Marcus saw me, he was still trying to flip the story, still clinging to the belief that charm could rewrite fact. But this wasn't a story he could narrate anymore. It was mine, typed, signed, closed, and tucked neatly away. A week after the final email, I went to the bank one last time. Not for a meeting, not for paperwork, just to close the account. The branch was quiet. Mid-morning, soft hum of printers and low conversations drifting through the air. I waited behind an elderly couple who chatted kindly with the teller, their smiles easy and warm. When it was my turn, I stepped forward and slid my ID across the desk. I'd like to close my joint checking account. It was frozen recently. Now I'd like it gone. The woman behind the counter nodded. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. She tapped her keyboard with the kind of practiced confidence that told me this wasn't her first time watching someone sever a financial tie that carried more than just numbers. It took less than 5 minutes. A few clicks, a confirmation screen. Then she slid a final receipt across the counter. "You're all set," she said, offering a polite, knowing smile. I thanked her, folded the paper into thirds, tucked it into my wallet. Then I walked out of the building with nothing in my name attached to Marcus Shaw. The sun hit differently that morning, not warmer, not brighter, just clearer. For so long that account had been a symbol, a tether, a piece of unfinished business masquerading as shared responsibility. Even after the breakup, even after the theft, even after the confrontation, it had lingered. But now it was gone, not suspended, not frozen, closed. I drove home with the windows down. No music, just the sound of wind threading through the quiet. At home, I pulled the receipt from my wallet and placed it at the very back of the folder. The final page. Then I sealed the folder in a large manila envelope, labeled it discreetly, and filed it in my cabinet under a personal archive. It didn't need to sit on my desk anymore. It had done its job. The space it once occupied now held something else, a blank notebook. Clean pages waiting for new thoughts, new plans, untouched by defense or documentation. Later, I made tea and stepped onto my balcony. The city moved around me with its usual rhythm: delivery trucks, kids walking home from school, conversations rising and fading in the distance. Marcus wasn't in any of it. Not in the noise, not in the air, not in the residue. The account was closed. The silence had spoken. And the ending didn't need to be loud to be final. Somewhere along the way, I stopped checking for his messages. Not out of avoidance, but because I no longer expected anything of value to come from that direction. Marcus had gone quiet. Or maybe I had just tuned him out so completely that even his noise no longer registered. Either way, the silence remained. And this time, it felt earned. I still received banking alerts, soft chimes when transactions cleared, balances shifted, or new statements posted. Once those sounds had triggered a quiet dread, a low pulse of anxiety beneath the surface. Now they felt different. They weren't reminders of what was taken. They were affirmations of what I'd reclaimed: vigilance, autonomy, boundaries. I didn't watch the account anymore. It no longer existed. But I watched myself, closely, intentionally. I paid attention to the spaces where trust used to live, and I protected them not out of fear, but out of respect. For the version of me that didn't raise her voice. For the version of me who still took action. For the version who documented, who moved in silence, who never let the quiet confuse her. That version deserved care. She deserved a future that wasn't weighed down by memory or permission or apology. I thought of the woman I was before the account, before Marcus. The one who believed that fairness could be assumed, that good intentions would balance everything out. She wasn't naive. She was hopeful. But hope, when placed in the hands of someone careless, becomes a liability. So I took it back. I stopped making room for people who didn't show up with care. I stopped explaining silence as fragility. And I stopped mistaking avoidance for peace. Because what I'd learned, page by page, statement by statement, was this: quiet doesn't mean small. It doesn't mean passive. And it never means powerless. Quiet can be a boundary. Quiet can be a response. Quiet can be the clearest version of enough. I thought about something Marcus once said to me in the early days. You've got this calm that's almost intimidating. Back then, I laughed, brushed it off like it was a compliment I didn't fully understand. Now, I see it for what it was. He noticed the steel beneath the softness. He just never thought it would be turned on him. The calm wasn't my weakness. It was my weapon. And I didn't have to lift it loudly to use it. It's easy to overlook quiet women, the ones who don't explode, who don't throw scenes, who don't shout in public or beg in private. But that's where real strength lives. In restraint, in strategy, in knowing when to wait and when to move without asking permission. I never needed revenge. I didn't need Marcus to crumble or confess or feel shame in a way that made me feel bigger. I just needed truth, and I got it. Not in his words, but in the documents, the timeline, the way the system responded to fact when presented without frills. The alerts still ping now and then, but not from suspicion, from structure. They are my way of staying aligned, grounded, intentional. They remind me that protection is not a reaction, it's a decision. That silence, when wielded with clarity, can cut sharper than any confrontation. I think about the younger version of me sometimes, the one who thought love meant tolerating unpredictability, bending when needed, staying soft to keep the peace. She wasn't weak. She was generous. But generosity given without boundaries becomes a debt that can't be repaid. So I drew new ones. And when I did, I learned something rare. Peace isn't given. It's built, line by line, page by page, step by quiet step. Somewhere, Marcus is still telling his story. Maybe he softened the facts. Maybe he tells people it was a misunderstanding, that it got blown out of proportion, that I overreacted. Let him. Because I don't need to rewrite him. I've already written me. The woman who noticed. The woman who waited. The woman who built a folder instead of raising her voice. It's not the kind of ending people cheer for out loud. There's no dramatic confrontation, no headline making justice. Just a closed account, a printed record, and a steady walk out of a cafe. But I don't need noise to be heard. I don't need fire to be fierce. What I needed was to walk away, knowing that when it mattered, I didn't shrink. I chose myself. Not with fanfare, not with spectacle, just with a calm that proved once and for all that I never had to raise my voice to make it final.